From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now! Newly revealed documents show the U.S. government has created a secret database of activists, lawyers, and journalists linked to the migrant caravans. We'll get the latest with The Intercept's Ryan Devereaux, who's been chronicling U.S. government repression on the border, and immigration attorney Nicole Ramos in Tijuana. The database includes details about the car she drives, her mother's name, and her work and travel history. Then U.S. Army whistleblower Chelsea Manning sent back to prison after refusing to testify before a grand jury investigating WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. We'll get response from Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald and Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. An Ethiopian Airlines flight traveling from the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa, to Nairobi, Kenya, crashed Sunday morning, killing all 157 passengers and crew on board. The Boeing 737 was carrying passengers of 35 different nationalities, including 8 Americans. The UN confirmed at least 19 of its staffers were on board the plane. This is the second fatal crash of a Boeing 737 MAX 8 in the past 5 months after Indonesian Lion Air Flight 610 crashed last October, killing 189 people. China, Indonesia, and Ethiopia announced they are grounding the aircrafts following the crash. U.S. Army whistleblower Chelsea Manning has been sent back to jail after refusing to answer questions before a grand jury Friday. Manning had been subpoenaed by federal prosecutors in Virginia's Eastern District to appear for questioning about her 2010 release to WikiLeaks of hundreds of thousands of State Department and Pentagon documents about the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Manning was imprisoned from 2010 to 2017 for the leak. Manning's lawyer says they'll appeal for her release. This is whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers in 1971, speaking to Democracy Now!
I think it's very important that journalists realize and publishers realize that their own ability to operate under the First Amendment and to do their function in a free society is being challenged, attacked here, specifically through Chelsea Manning, as it has been for many years. It's still going on. And she's never done anything more admirable than her current refusal to take part in that assault on the free press.
We'll hear more from Daniel Ellsberg and speak to journalist Glenn Greenwald about Chelsea Manning after headlines. President Trump is set to unveil his 2020 budget proposal today and will reportedly request $8.6 billion to fund his wall on the U.S.-Mexico border, alongside an additional $3.6 billion to make up for military construction funds he said he's diverting as part of his national emergency. In a joint statement, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said, quote, Congress refused to fund his wall, and he was forced to admit defeat and reopen the government. The same thing will repeat itself if he tries this again. We hope he learned his lesson, they said. In addition to border wall funds, Trump's budget boosts military spending, cuts non-defense-related domestic spending, including slashing the budget for renewable energy, and sets a 15-year timeline for eliminating the deficit. Dana Sabraw, the federal judge who last June ordered the Trump administration to stop separating migrant families at the border and reunite nearly 3,000 children with their parents, ruled on Friday that families who were separated at the border as early as July 2017 should also be included in his order and be allowed to join a class action lawsuit brought by the ACLU. The order previously only included families whose children were in government custody on June 26, 2018. Sabraw cited a January Health and Human Services report that acknowledged thousands more children were likely ripped from their parents starting much earlier than stated, but that the government failed to properly track those children. The House passed the For the People Act Friday, a wide-ranging bill that seeks to expand voting rights and curb gerrymandering, reduce big money in political campaigns, and strengthen ethics requirements for political candidates. One of the bill's provisions would make voter registration automatic. This is Democratic Congressmember John Lewis speaking on the House floor.
If not us, then who? If not now, then when? The time has arrived to tear down the barrier to the ballot box. Today, we are able to do our part in this long fight for the very soul of our nation.
Not a single Republican voted in favor of the bill. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has already said he will not bring the bill to a vote. An investigation by the New York Times found several trucks carrying so-called humanitarian aid that were set ablaze during a showdown at the Colombia-Venezuela border last month were not caused by President Nicolas Maduro's forces, as was widely reported at the time by both the media and Trump administration officials. National Security Advisor John Bolton, Vice President Mike Pence, Senator Marco Rubio, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo immediately condemned Maduro for the incident, using it to heighten calls for his removal. But a new analysis from the New York Times refutes this version of events and says instead it's likely a Molotov cocktail thrown by an anti-government protester started the fire. Some were quick to point out witnesses and independent journalists had already been countering the U.S. government narrative. Writing for The Intercept, journalist Glenn Greenwald called out mainstream media outlets for republishing the false claims. He wrote, quote, "Every major U.S. war of the last several decades has begun the same way. The U.S. government fabricates an inflammatory, emotionally provocative lie, which large U.S. media outlets uncritically treat as truth while refusing to air questioning or dissent, thus inflaming primal anger against the country the U.S. wants to attack." We'll speak with Glenn Greenwald later in the broadcast. In more news from Venezuela, local reports have emerged that the ongoing power outage has killed 17 people in hospitals where backup generators failed. President Nicolas Maduro said last week anti-government saboteurs backed by the United States took the nation's main hydroelectric power station at the Guri Dam offline. Meanwhile, the New York Times wrote Friday, U.S. sanctions have curbed Venezuelan imports of fuel that could have powered the dam following the failure. Opposition leader, self-declared interim President Juan Guaido, said he will call for a state of a national emergency in the Venezuelan parliament today. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared Israel as, quote, not a state of all its citizens, as he engaged in a social media spat with Israeli celebrity Rotem Selah over the weekend. The well-known model and host wrote on Instagram Saturday, "When the hell will someone in this government tell the public that Israel is a country of all its citizens?" after watching an interview with the Israeli culture minister. Netanyahu responded directly to Selah on Instagram, writing, quote, "Israel is not a state of all its citizens. According to the basic nationality law we passed, Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people and only it," unquote. The comments came days after Israel banned an alliance of Israeli Arab parties from fielding candidates for Israel's Knesset, the parliament, and as Israel is just 1 month away from a general election. In news from Gaza, mourners held a funeral Saturday for 23-year-old Tamar Arafat, who died after Israeli forces shot him during Friday protests at the Israeli separation barrier. Israeli fire wounded 42 others who turned out as part of the weekly Great March of Return demonstrations, which will mark their one-year anniversary at the end of this month. Following the House's overwhelming passage of a resolution Thursday condemning anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, white supremacy, and other forms of hate, Fox News host Jeanine Pirro attacked Congressmember Ilhan Omar, one of the 2 Muslim women now serving in Congress, for wearing a hijab.
Omar wears a hijab, which, according to the Quran 33:59, tells women to cover so they won't get molested. Is her adherence to this Islamic doctrine indicative of her adherence to Sharia law, which in itself is antithetical to the United States Constitution?
Critics blasted former Judge Piro's remarks, pointing to the First Amendment of the Constitution, which protects freedom of religion. As outrage mounted, Fox News condemned her comments late Sunday, saying in a statement, quote, "We strongly condemn Jeanine Pirro's comments about Representative Ilhan Omar. They do not reflect those of the network, and we have addressed the matter with her directly," unquote. After her historic election victory last November, Congressmember Omar spearheaded the overturning of a long-standing ban on headscarves and other religious headwear, becoming the first lawmaker to wear a hijab on the House floor. Eric Prince, founder of private security company Blackwater, said in a recent Al Jazeera interview he met with Trump campaign representatives in August of 2016, despite not disclosing the meeting during a hearing before the House Intelligence Committee in 2017, according to official transcripts. This is Prince speaking with reporter and host Mehdi Hassan.
They specifically asked you what context you have, and you didn't answer that.
I don't believe I was asked that question.
You were asked, were there any formal communications or contact with the campaign? You said, apart from writing papers, putting up yard signs, no. That's what you said. I've got the transcript of the conversation here.
Sure. I mean, I might have been, I think I was at Trump headquarters or the campaign headquarters.
Trump Tower, August 3rd, 2016. You,
possible.
An Israeli dude, a back channel to the Emiratis and the Saudis, Don Jr., Stephen Miller.
We're there to talk about Iran policy.
Mother Jones reported Saturday Florida businesswoman Cindy Yang, who founded the spa where billionaire New England Patriots owner Robert Kraft is said to have solicited sex, also ran a business selling access to President Trump. Kraft was charged last month with hundreds of others as part of a human trafficking sting. The self-described international business consulting firm run by Yang is aimed at Chinese executives touting access to Trump, members of his administration, and his family at his Mar-a-Lago resort. The story was published a day after a selfie of Yang and Trump emerged from a Super Bowl viewing party at Mar-a-Lago in February. According to the Miami Herald, Yang and her family have donated nearly $60,000 to Trump's campaign and a Trump PAC since 2017. Yang was not charged in last month's crackdown on Florida day spas and has said she sold the spa linked to Kraft in 2013. And Massachusetts Senator and 2020 hopeful Elizabeth Warren has unveiled a plan to break up tech giants like Facebook, Google, and Amazon. In a post published on Medium, Warren proposes classifying companies that bring in over $25 billion a year as platform utilities and barring these utilities from selling their own products. That would mean, for example, Google could not advertise Google products on its search platform and that Facebook would have to divest from apps like Instagram. Warren blamed tech monopolies for stifling competition as well as overreach due to how user data is collected and used. At a rally in Long Island City, New York, where local protests and political pressure recently led Amazon to withdraw its plan for a new HQ2 campus, Senator Warren shared her plan with supporters Friday night.
They think they can come to towns, cities, states, and bully everyone into doing what they want. They think they can scoop up all of our personal data and sell it to whoever they want for whatever purposes.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Newly revealed documents show the U.S. government created a secret database of activists and journalists who were documenting the Trump administration's efforts to thwart a caravan of migrants hoping to win asylum in the U.S. An investigation from San Diego's NBC7 revealed the list was shared among Homeland Security Investigations, ICE, Customs and Border Protection, and the FBI. It included the names of 10 journalists, 7 of whom were U.S. citizens, along with nearly 4 dozen others listed as organizers or instigators. Some of the journalists and at least one immigration lawyer had alerts placed on their passports that prevented them from entering Mexico. Others on the list reported they were stopped by Mexican police or were subjected to lengthy interviews and searches when re-entering the U.S. House Democrats are now calling for the full disclosure of the government's secret list. On Thursday, Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom of California said it was ironic the government knew more about journalists and attorneys than it did about the missing migrant children it had detained.
I mean, the irony of that shouldn't be lost on anyone, that we have better data collection against journalists than we do children and parents. We found out 471 parents have been removed from their children, and yet we have deep data collection on all of you. That's America in 2019.
Well, for more, we're joined by Ryan Devereaux, staff reporter at The Intercept, where he covers immigration enforcement, the drug war, and national security. In early February, he wrote an article headlined "Journalists, Lawyers, and Activists Working on the Border Face Coordinated Harassment from U.S. and Mexican Authorities." And in Tijuana, Mexico, we're joined by Nicole Ramos, who is director of the Border Rights Project of Al Otro Lado, a project that works with asylum seekers in Tijuana, Mexico. The group also conducts human rights monitoring on the U.S.-Mexico border. Ramos is one of the people on the government's secret list. NBC7 reports her dossier includes personal details, including specific information about the car she drives, her mother's name, and her work and travel history. Ryan Devereaux and Nicole Ramos, welcome to Democracy Now! Ryan, I'm going to begin with you. Talk about what you uncovered and the significance of this list.
Right. So in early February, we published a report revealing a sweeping government intelligence gathering operation involving U.S. and Mexican law enforcement targeting journalists, lawyers, and advocates working in the border area around Tijuana and San Diego, folks who'd been in contact with the migrant caravan. Our reporting showed that this uptick in scrutiny picked up around December and January, in conjunction with a couple of high-profile events in the area involving CBP tear gassing, groups of migrants. What we discovered was that Mexican municipal police were sort of going around near the wall, approaching photojournalists, photographing their passports. In one case, a group of journalists who were approached by Mexican law enforcement asked who the Mexicans were taking photos for, and they said, "For the Americans." The consequences of this intelligence gathering operation were that a number of journalists were subjected to secondary screening when they attempted to go back into the United States. They were asked questions about activists working near the border. Phones were confiscated, electronics were searched. Advocates also with migrant organizations were taken into custody, pumped for information as well. In one case, a volunteer I spoke to was handcuffed to a steel bench for 5 hours. All of the questioning that was described to us points to U.S. government interest in targeting activists involved in the migrant caravans making their way north to the United States that have obviously inflamed the outrage of President Trump.
NBC San Diego followed up on your reporting and found more and more examples of the surveillance. What else did they find? That's
correct. The NBC News report, in sort of an extraordinary fashion, confirmed what we'd reported in February, laying out how the government actually put this stuff in writing, made lists of so-called instigators, organizers, journalists, activists, and it's completely consistent with what we found last month. I spoke to folks who were presented sort of sheets of paper with photographs of activists, asked who they know. The government clearly went to some pretty significant lengths here to gather information on people who had a nexus to the caravans.
On Thursday, Customs and Border Protection told San Diego's NBC7 the secret list was a necessary response to assaults against Border Patrol agents that took place last November and in January. The agency's Assistant Commissioner of Public Affairs, Andrew Meehan, said the agency, quote, identified individuals who may have information relating to the instigators and or organizers of the attacks. Meehan added, efforts to gather this type of information are a standard law enforcement practice. Meehan also said, quote, CBP does not target journalists for inspection based on their occupation or their reporting. Ryan Devereaux.
Well, a few things about that. A number of the folks who were targeted in this operation weren't present at the events that are referred to in that statement. Some of the interrogations that were described to me began months earlier, and a number of folks weren't even there. Second, in order for the government to take a hard look at a journalist's work, they have to meet a certain sort of bar, a higher threshold. Those sorts of protections exist for First Amendment reasons. What seems to have happened here, in the words of the ACLU, is that the authorities on the border sort of did an end around DOJ restrictions on how they can approach journalists about events that they witnessed, information that they've gathered. What we're seeing here seems to be a real effort to circumvent those restrictions.
Nicole Ramos, if you can talk about what it means to be on this list, how you discovered you were on it, and what's happened to you since.
What it means to be on this list is that you are an individual who has either challenged U.S. Customs and Border Protection policy and violations of asylum seekers' rights, or you have somehow documented that as a journalist or borne witness to it as an activist or a member of the clergy. With respect to the impact of the list on myself and my co-directors, on January 10th, my global entry pass was confiscated and revoked when I entered the United States from Mexico. I have made this crossing dozens of times using my global entry pass, which allows me to have an expedited crossing, cutting my travel time from 20 minutes, what could essentially be 3 hours. My last crossing prior to it being confiscated was on January 7th. The cover page of this dossier is January 9th, and my global entry was revoked on January 10th. Since our inclusion in this dossier, my co-directors, Erica Pinheiro and Nora Phillips, were denied entry into Mexico. They entered for different reasons, for work and for travel, and they were subsequently removed from Mexico. Ironically, in the case of my co-director, Erica Pinheiro, she, while working on the family separation cases, as we are one of the only legal providers for parents who were deported from the border without their children, was separated from her own Mexican citizen child because of the U.S. government alert placed on her passport.
So what has the government said to you about why they're doing this? You're a U.S. citizen?
The government has not provided any reason other than a canned response, which includes the variety of reasons one might not qualify for global entry, including the fact that one is under investigation for a violation of U.S. immigration or U.S. criminal law. That indicated to me that I was under some kind of investigation, but they would neither confirm nor deny whether that was true. We've attempted to obtain more information about the alerts placed on our passports through the discovery process of our litigation at El Otro Lado v. Nielsen. However, we have not been able to obtain further information through that process.
You're a U.S. citizen?
Yes, I am a U.S. citizen.
How has this inhibited your work, prevented you from doing your work? And explain what El Otro Lado is.
El Otro Lado is a binational legal services organization that serves refugees and deportees in the Tijuana border region, as well as undocumented individuals in Los Angeles County. We provide Know Your Rights training and legal orientation to asylum seekers who are trapped in Tijuana by the United States government's illegal policies of preventing them from accessing the port of entry. And we are a thorn in the U.S. government's side. We are the main litigant in El Otro Lado v. Nielsen, which challenges CBP's turning away of asylum seekers at the port of entry and the creation of an illegal wait list, which it operates in collaboration with the Mexican government. We have documented hundreds of asylum seekers whose rights have been violated by this policy, and we continue to document to this day, as well as arm asylum seekers with information about what their rights are in the system and how the U.S. government will seek to violate those rights, as well as strategies that they can use to protect themselves when interacting with U.S. officials. We are frequently defamed by U.S. officials after asylum seekers enter the port of entry with our materials. They tell asylum seekers that we are fake attorneys, that we are frauds, that we will charge them, that we are troublemakers, that they have no rights, and they should pay no attention to anything that we say. And they do this because every time that we document violations, we bring this to the public's light, we bring this to the light of the legislator, and frankly, they don't like being held accountable for these violations. And it's ironic that the U.S. government's largest law enforcement agency has such a terrible record of following its own federal law.
Last week, Nicole, in Congress, there was a highly contentious hearing with Democrats grilling the Homeland Security Secretary, Kirstjen Nielsen. You say that she is guilty of perjury. Why?
The parents that were deported without their children, of which our organization has worked intensely on these cases, with Erica Pinheiro leading that effort, we have documented in every single case of every single family that we've interviewed, coercion, physical abuse, and lies that were told to these parents in order to get them to sign for their own removal. They were told that their children would be on the planes with them or would be in a separate children's plane. She perjured herself. And so Secretary Nielsen should not only be investigated for perjury, but she should be thankful that the United States does not submit to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, because she is guilty of genocide.
Explain that further. Very serious charges, to say the least.
The forcible separation of children from their parents is an act of genocide. This was a very well-planned, orchestrated policy designed to break the spirits of asylum seekers so that they would stop coming to our border seeking protection. This was not a policy designed to deter illegal migration, because many of the families that were separated presented themselves at U.S. ports of entry in accordance with U.S. law. This was a policy designed to prevent people from accessing their legal right, and the forcible separation of families is an act of genocide. And it is reminiscent of the forcible separation of Native American children from their families when they were placed in boarding schools, which is also an act of genocide.
Nicole Ramos, on Friday, a federal judge, Judge Sabra, expanded a class action lawsuit to include thousands more migrant families separated at the border before the Trump administration's zero tolerance policy was announced in 2018. Your response on the significance of this?
I personally think that that class should be expanded. We have documented separation of children from their parents by U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers since at least May of 2017. Further, I would like to know what is going to be the Department of Homeland Security's response for the parents that currently remain detained and separated from their children. Just 2 weeks ago, Al Otro Lado presented 29 parents that had been forcibly separated from their children and deported back to Central America. They represented themselves to U.S. immigration authorities at the Calexico port of entry with documentation showing they had been forcibly separated and showing that they had true asylum claims that deserved to be heard by a judge. Many of those parents are now detained in ICE detention centers, still not reunited with their families, subjected to horrific conditions, and during their processing by CBP and by ICE have been subjected to humiliation, more verbal coercion, and derision, being told that they are liars. This is not acceptable.
Ryan Devereaux, on the story, the headline of your story is "Journalists, Lawyers, and Activists Working on the Border Face Coordinated Harassment from U.S. and Mexican authorities." The Mexico's Foreign Relations Office released a statement saying the government of Mexico disapproves of all acts of illegal espionage against any person, domestic or foreign. The Mexican government does not conduct illegal surveillance on anyone for any type of category or activity. Mexico's Foreign Relations Office also said it'll ask the U.S. government to, quote, clarify any possible cases of illegal spying. When we were on the border and we we went over to the Mexico side and we're coming back. Mexican authorities came up with us, and one of the guys said, I just want to do a selfie with you. I want to do a selfie with you. But this kind of documentation, we understood, was about getting photographs.
It's interesting that the Mexican government raised the specter of illegal espionage in the context of these revelations, because that wasn't what I was asking them about. But it's worth remembering that the Mexican government, Mexican law enforcement in the past has been shown to use extreme measures and techniques to target advocates. Look back at the case of the 43 students from Ayotzinapa, the college. Their attorneys were targeted by powerful software that Mexican law enforcement used to get into their phones. We know that Mexican law enforcement is willing to push the envelope. So that raises serious questions about what sort of restrictions they're placing on their own officers as they're working in conjunction with the U.S. government. And that's something the lawmakers should be taking a hard look at.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. Ryan Devereaux broke this story, reporter for The Intercept. We'll link to your reporting. And Nicole Ramos, thanks so much for joining us from Tijuana, Mexico. Al Otro Lado is her group targeted for doing her job. We want to thank you for being with us as well. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, Glenn Greenwald, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, will join us from Brazil to talk about a number of issues from Venezuela to the jailing of Chelsea Manning. Stay with us. U.S. Army whistleblower Chelsea Manning has been sent back to jail after refusing to answer questions before a grand jury investigating WikiLeaks and its founder, Julian Assange. Manning had been subpoenaed by federal prosecutors in Virginia's Eastern District to appear for questioning about her 2010 leak to WikiLeaks of hundreds of thousands of State Department and Pentagon documents about the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Manning was imprisoned from 2010 to 2017 for the leak. President Obama commuted her sentence before he left office. Chelsea Manning briefly spoke to reporters on Friday on her way into court.
So this is a contempt hearing. It's a sealed hearing. The public isn't allowed. The proceedings are going to happen in secret. The filings are sealed, so can't really talk about the specifics of what's going on beyond what we explained in the statement. But I'm pretty confident that we have a basis and a grounds on which to oppose this.
And you said in your statement you're prepared to go to jail for this.
If it comes to that, yeah. If it comes to that, it comes to that. If it comes to going, I might not leave here today, free. So.
In a written statement, Chelsea Manning later said, quote, "I will not comply with this or any other grand jury. Imprisoning me for my refusal to answer questions only subjects me to additional punishment for my repeatedly stated ethical objections to the grand jury system. The grand jury's questions pertain to disclosures from 9 years ago and took place 6 years after an in-depth computer forensics case in which I testified for almost a full day about these events. I stand by my previous public testimony," she wrote. Well, on Sunday, Democracy Now! Spoke with Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg at his home in California.
This is a continuation of 7.5 years of torture of Chelsea Manning in an effort to get her to contribute to incriminating WikiLeaks, so that they can bring Julian Assange or WikiLeaks to trial on charges that would not apply to the New York Times. It's been speculated for years now that the secret charges, if they did exist, and apparently they do exist, against Julian Assange, were under the same charges that I was the first person to be prosecuted for back in 1971. Violations of the Espionage Act, conspiracy, and theft. It would be the same case as brought against me. Unfortunately, bringing that against the journalist is even more blatantly a violation of the First Amendment, freedom of the press. And although Donald Trump has made it very plain he would love to prosecute and convict the New York Times, he doesn't have the guts to do that, to do what he wants, fortunately, because it would be so obviously unconstitutional that although his base would be happy with it, and he would be happy with it, he would get into too much trouble constitutionally. So he wants to find charges against Julian that would be different from mine, because if he brought the same charges that he brought against me, in this case against a journalist, it would clearly be found unconstitutional. And so Chelsea, having failed to give them what they wanted over 7.5 years here, she was incarcerated, or since, or in the grand jury, namely false incriminating charges against WikiLeaks. They're resorting against a torture which does work at getting false confessions. That's what it's for. That's what it mainly does. They wanted to contradict her earlier sworn testimony many times, that she behaved in relation to WikiLeaks exactly as she would have to the New York Times or the Washington Post, to whom she went first before going to WikiLeaks, and they didn't pick up on what she was offering. So she went to WikiLeaks. But she took sole responsibility not to spare them, but because that was the truth, and she tells the truth. She's a very patriotic person. I know no one more patriotic, actually, willing to risk and even give her own freedom, her own life, in order to preserve our constitutional freedoms. And the Constitution, I admire her then, I admire her now, and right now she's refusing to take part in basically a conspiracy against press freedom in this country, led by the President of the United States and the Secretary of State.
Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg speaking on Sunday to Democracy Now! Ellsberg went on to talk about the historical significance of Chelsea Manning's actions.
We know the questions that were asked Chelsea in the day that she spent in the grand jury, and also were asked another witness who did testify, David House. In both cases, they were asked only about their relations with WikiLeaks in 2010, 9 years ago, long before the very controversial and properly controversial actions of WikiLeaks in the last year or two. This was when WikiLeaks was putting out what Chelsea gave them, the video of collateral murder, which I urge people to look at. Now, I'm sure very few have seen that in the last 9 years. What they are witnessing is a very typical, by all reporting, act of murder. And I say that as a former Marine operations officer who taught the laws of wars to battalion, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines at Camp Lejeune. And I would hope that anyone that I taught would recognize in that film that what they're watching is a war crime, is murder. Not all killing and war is murder, but some of it is. And she revealed it.
Clear. Clear. Should have a van in the middle of the road with about 12 to 15 bodies.
Oh yeah, look at that, right through the windshield.
She also revealed massive, widespread torture being conducted by our Iraqi allies with our knowledge and complicity going on into President Obama's term from George W. Bush. So there's a lot of resentment against her in the intelligence community and in the Army in general about the shameful things that she revealed. Also assassination squads, death squads, and corruption in general that we condoned in our allies, among dictators like Ben Ali of Tunisia, who was forced out by nonviolent protest on the basis of Chelsea Manning's revelations through Le Monde.
Daniel Ellsberg speaking Sunday to Democracy Now! About Chelsea Manning. Ellsberg himself faced life imprisonment after leaking the Pentagon papers about the Vietnam War. He was a high-level Pentagon official who obtained the papers while working at the Rand Corporation. When we come back, we'll speak to Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute. Music by Mangueira, Brazil's most famous samba school. Last week, Mangueira won Carnival in Rio de Janeiro, getting a perfect score from judges for its float honoring Rio Councilwoman Marielle Franco, who was assassinated almost a year ago. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. U.S. Army whistleblower Chelsea Manning has been sent back to jail after refusing to answer questions before a grand jury investigating WikiLeaks and its founder, Julian Assange. Manning had been subpoenaed by federal prosecutors in Virginia's Eastern District to appear for questioning about her 2010 leak to WikiLeaks of hundreds of thousands of State Department and Pentagon documents about the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. To talk more about the jailing of Manning, as well as other issues, including what's happening in Venezuela, we turn right now to Glenn Greenwald, speaking to us from Brazil. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, one of the founding editors of The Intercept. Glenn, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about Chelsea Manning once again being jailed.
I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that Chelsea Manning is extraordinarily heroic. She's demonstrated that repeatedly over the last decade in all kinds of ways. But what she's doing here is really remarkable because the context is that the Trump administration is trying to do what the Obama administration tried to do, but ultimately concluded it couldn't do without jeopardizing press freedoms, which is to prosecute WikiLeaks and Julian Assange for what it regards as the crime of publishing top secret or classified documents. And the media in the United States has spent 2 years screaming about the threat that Trump poses to press freedoms because he says mean things about the media on Twitter or insults Wolf Blitzer and Chuck Todd. And yet here we have what is really a grave threat to press freedom, the attempt to make it a felony to publish classified material, which is what WikiLeaks did. Even the anti-press freedom Obama administration said this was a bridge too far for us. And while most reporters are mute on this scandal, on this controversy, and while a lot of Democrats are supportive of it because they still hate WikiLeaks so much from the 2016 election that they're happy to see Julian Assange go to jail, even if it means standing behind the Trump administration, Chelsea Manning is not just opposing it, she's opposing it to the point where she refuses to participate in it, even if it means, as it now does, that she's going to be jailed for being in contempt of court for refusing to comply with the subpoena. We all owe our immense gratitude to Chelsea Manning for everything she's done over the last decade, but even more so now.
I'd like to go back to 2017 when Mike Pompeo talked about Chelsea Manning in his first address as CIA director in April of last year.
WikiLeaks walks like a hostile intelligence service and talks like a hostile intelligence service, and has encouraged its followers to find jobs at the CIA in order to obtain intelligence. It directed Chelsea Manning in her theft of specific secret information. It overwhelmingly focuses on the United States while seeking support from anti-democratic countries and organizations. It's time to call out WikiLeaks for what it really is: a non-state hostile intelligence service often abetted by state actors like Russia.
So that was Pompeo when he was head of the CIA. Now, of course, he is Secretary of State. Can you respond to what he has said, Glenn Greenwald?
This is the part I find so amazing. Do Democrats not realize the irony here of cheering for the most reactionary right-wing forces in the Trump administration, who are the ones trying to imprison Julian Assange and WikiLeaks in order to criminalize journalism, namely Mike Pompeo, and the person who actually first vowed to put WikiLeaks and Assange behind bars, which was then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who has since left the Trump administration. The Obama administration tried to create theories to say that WikiLeaks did more than just passively receive documents from Chelsea Manning and then publish them, because they knew they had to do that in order to prosecute WikiLeaks. Otherwise, how do you justify prosecuting WikiLeaks for publishing classified documents without also prosecuting the New York Times and The Guardian? The Justice Department under Obama searched high and low for evidence that WikiLeaks participated in Chelsea Manning's taking of those documents. They found no evidence. She testified under oath that she acted alone, that they played no role whatsoever in her decision to do that. And now suddenly, 7 years later, Mike Pompeo claims that they have evidence, or that they believe that WikiLeaks told her to do it, and therefore they intend to prosecute WikiLeaks. And unfortunately, between the Republicans, who have long hated WikiLeaks for exposing the war crimes of the Bush administration, and Democrats who now hate WikiLeaks because they published documents that were harmful to or reflected poorly on Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party, very few people are willing to stand up to this very serious attack on press freedom. And thankfully, Chelsea Manning is one of those people.
I want to turn to John Bolton. Speaking about Chelsea Manning, in the 2012 BBC film WikiLeaks, The Secret Life of a Superpower, he was interviewed by Richard Bilton.
What do you think of Bradley Manning?
I think he committed treason. I think he should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law.
What does that mean?
Well, treason is the only crime defined by our Constitution, and it says treason shall consist only of levying war against the United States or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. And he gave our enemies a lot of aid and comfort.
So what should happen to him?
Well, he should be prosecuted, and if he's found guilty, he should be punished to the fullest extent possible.
And what is that?
Death.
You think he should be killed?
Yes.
You think he should be killed? Yes, responded John Bolton, now the National Security Advisor. Of course, Bradley Manning became Chelsea Manning. She announced her transition the day she was sentenced. Glenn Greenwald.
These are the sentiments that are driving the current attempt to prosecute WikiLeaks and Assange, and those are the monsters who are responsible for it. So I would hope that however angry someone might be at Julian Assange or WikiLeaks for whatever they think they did as part of the 2016 election to undermine Hillary Clinton by publishing truthful documents that showed the corruption of the DNC, however angry one might be at WikiLeaks for having done that, one can separate those emotions and understand that what the Trump administration has nothing to do with the 2016 election. The criminal proceedings that have led to Chelsea Manning's jailing for the second time in the last decade are all about documents that were published not in 2016, but in 2011 and 2012. And it's being done by people like John Bolton, who believe that if you publish top secret documents that report on the misdeeds and criminal acts of the U.S. government, you're not only a criminal, but a traitor who deserves to be killed. You just heard that with your own ears. And so anyone supporting the Trump administration's efforts to put Julian Assange in prison because you're angry about what he did in the 2016 election, you're aligning yourself with and you're empowering those warped sociopathic sentiments that you just heard come out of John Bolton's mouth.
Glenn Greenwald, I also want to talk to you about Venezuela. An investigation by the New York Times found several trucks carrying so-called humanitarian aid that were set ablaze during a showdown at the Colombia-Venezuela border last month were not caused by President Nicolas Maduro's forces, as was widely reported at the time by both media and Trump administration officials. This is Vice President Mike Pence.
Maduro's loyalists turned on their own people. As the world watched, they set fire to trucks loaded with food and medicine desperately needed by the Venezuelan people.
Independent journalist Max Blumenthal first raised questions about what happened in a piece on February 24th that was headlined "Burning Aid, an Interventionist Deception on Colombia-Venezuela Bridge." Glenn, your latest piece is headlined NYT's expose on the lies about burning aid trucks in Venezuela shows how U.S. government and media spread pro-war propaganda. Talk about the latest in Venezuela and how this has fueled that.
Every time the U.S. wants to start a new war, it does it the same way, which is it invents some really inflammatory, emotionally wrenching lie that gets people to hate the government they want to topple so much that they set their rationality aside and support the war. So they claim North Korea or North Vietnam attacked U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, which was a lie, to start the Vietnam War. They claim that Saddam had been ripping babies out of incubators in Kuwait to start the Gulf War, which was a lie. They claim weapons of mass destruction, which was a lie, to start the Iraq War. And now you have Marco Rubio and John Bolton and Elliot Abrams, the crew, the neocon crew, who are experts at lying to start wars, going around telling lies about what the Maduro government is doing. And regardless of what you think about the Maduro government or President Maduro himself, you should be highly angry when your own government, with the help of its media, lies to you in order to start a war. And this incident on February 23rd was incredibly important because that imagery of burning humanitarian trucks was very powerful. And the claim that it was Maduro's forces that did it came not just from Marco Rubio, who cited anti-Maduro media outlets with no evidence. CNN lied to the world. They claimed that their own journalists witnessed with their own eyes Maduro's forces throwing incendiary devices that set those trucks on fire. Right away, independent journalists, including Max Blumenthal, as well as Dan Cohen, who works at RT, looked at and studied, they were in Venezuela, the available footage, and said that it was clear that it was the anti-Maduro protesters who set those trucks on fire. But those people were ignored by the corporate media in the United States, which only paid attention to the people who were lying on behalf of the U.S. government, only aired the lies that it was the Maduro forces who did it. And then suddenly the New York Times comes out with a good expose that proves that it was a lie. They didn't bother to credit any of the independent journalists who did it 2 weeks ago using much of the same evidence, but they did show that it was a lie. And since then, Marco Rubio has got caught in 2 other lies. He claimed that babies were dying in hospitals, and then the Wall Street Journal reporter in Venezuela went to that hospital and said no babies had died. And also he claimed that a dam that he called the German dam had collapsed because of the energy shortages, when in reality there was no dam that collapsed. The person who reported it was named German Dam, and Marco Rubio confused that and thought that it was a dam that had collapsed. So he's running around Venezuela telling all kinds of lies, acting like a buffoon and a clown with John Bolton and Elliot Abrams in tow in order to try and start a new war in Venezuela. And as usual, the corporate media, unlike Democracy Now!, which has put Venezuelan officials on to give the other side of the story, the corporate media in the U.S. have completely excluded any questioning or dissent of any of these storylines and have allowed these lies to go unchallenged. And in the case of CNN, have often vouched for the lies themselves.
So I wanted to go to this issue that you just raised. Local reporting emerging that ongoing power outage has killed 17 people in hospitals where backup generators failed. President Maduro saying last week anti-government saboteurs backed by the U.S. took the nation's main hydroelectric power station at the Guri Dam offline. Meanwhile, the New York Times reporting the sanctions have affected Venezuela's ability to import and produce the fuel required by the thermal power plants that could have backed up the Guri plant once it failed. If you could respond to all this, and especially President Maduro's accusation that the power outage, which has plunged the country into darkness, though the electricity is coming back now, was as a result of a plot backed by the United States.
Well, one really interesting part of that New York Times expose that got very little attention was buried within, I think, the 12th or 13th paragraph was an acknowledgement that the reason for the power outages, at least in large part, were the sanctions that the U.S. has imposed on Venezuela that has made it impossible for Venezuela to get the energy that it needs to provide to its people. And so, as usual, the sanctions regime that's being done in the name of helping the Venezuelan people is one of the biggest factors in their suffering, deprivation, and misery.
Finally, Glenn, your response to what's happened in the United States and Congress to Ilhan Omar and the ultimate, just general statement against hatred of all forms that the House passed.
It's just so ironic that the whole controversy began, actually in response to one of my tweets, by her simply pointing out that just like the NRA and Wall Street and the fossil fuel industry controls Congress through the use of money and lobbying power, so too does the Israeli lobby, making it impossible for dissent to be aired. And the 3 weeks of controversy that ensued proved her point, as people treated her as though she had said something anti-Semitic when in fact she never mentioned or even alluded to Jews at all. The Israel lobby is composed of evangelicals, of militarists, of neocons, of all kinds of people. And she was simply trying to air a debate that is urgently needed, but that never takes place in Washington. And for that, she has been vilified, not just by members of the Republican Party, but also the cowards in her own party with all kinds of character attacks and smears. And yet she's incredibly brave. As she said herself, she survived a war in Somalia. This is nothing, and she's going to continue, and I'm really grateful for this, to do the things she was sent to Washington to do, which is exactly to raise these issues, no matter how many names she's called for doing it.
I wanted to get your response to Judge Jeanine Pirro, who was speaking on Fox News after the resolution passed against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, white supremacy, and other forms of hate. She attacked Congressmember Ilhan Omar, one of the 2 Muslim women in Congress now, for wearing a hijab. Your response, Glenn?
I mean, no decent person needs to explain to them why what Jeanine Pirro said is absolutely disgusting and bigoted and repulsive and ignorant. And in fact, what I find really interesting is that even people at Fox News, including a Muslim producer, publicly denounced Jeanine Pirro in a viral tweet. And then Fox News itself repudiated her remarks and said that they were inappropriate and that they had spoken with her privately and made clear their disapproval. So just think about that. Her remarks were so grotesque that they went way over the line, even for Fox News and its very low standards for what you're allowed to say about Muslims. But this is, I mean, Jeanine Pirro this is who she's always been. For people who live in New York, people have always known that. And this is the kind of bigotry that's typically allowed to be expressed about Muslims in a way that you're not allowed to express it about any other group. She just went a little too far in being a little too explicit, and therefore got denounced even by Fox News for having done so.
Glenn Greenwald, I want to thank you very much for being with us. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, one of the founding editors of The Intercept. And that does it for our show. Democracy Now! Has an immediate job opening for a full-time junior systems administrator here in our New York City studios. Details are available at democracynow.org. And I'll be headed to Colorado on Friday. I'll be speaking in Denver at the historic East High School. That's 7 o'clock, March 15th, the Ides of March. To check out information on this, you can go to democracynow.org. If you'd like to sign up for our daily digest, our daily headlines and news alerts, you can go to democracynow.org, or you can text the word Democracy Now!, one word, to 66866. That's Democracy Now!, to 66866. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermin Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Ravi Karen, Honey Masood, Trina Dura, Tay Maria Studio, and Libby Rainey. Special thanks to James Pace-Comstock. I'm Amy Goodman.